I now look to Lee Chin-wee, Chair of the Debate Selection Committee, Trinity College, to open the case for the opposition.
Before launching into my arguments, I would just like to thank a few people tonight for making this possible. I would first like to thank my political opponents for helping to disqualify me for the upcoming union elections. It's given me much more time to prepare for this speech, and I genuinely couldn't have done it without you. I would also like to thank Dan, Brendan, and Amy for having me. All three of them share my belief that the union should be a place for reasoned discussion and debate, a place where everyone can feel at home. I would also like to thank our distinguished guests, all who have taken their time off their busy schedules to join us tonight. You have just heard a speech from Beatrice, a first-year history and politics student who's on the Secretary's Committee in the union. I've been told by my sources that Beatrice hates debaters and thinks they're the worst people in the world. I'm quite offended by that. After all, we aren't even the worst people in the union. But regardless, I wish her all the best for tomorrow's election. In second proposition, we have Mitchell Garabedian, a lawyer who represented victims in Boston in the aftermath of the Catholic priest sexual abuse scandal. In third proposition, we have Elizabeth Coppin, a survivor of abuse who is currently bringing a case against the Irish government to the United Nations Committee Against Torture. And in fourth proposition, we have Thomas Rayleigh, a former Massachusetts Attorney General who led the investigation into the Boston sexual abuse scandal. And ordinarily, these introductions are quite humorous, but I'm sure you would all agree there is nothing lighthearted about what we are discussing tonight. Mr. President, these are your guests, and we are honored to have them tonight. You know, to be clear, most of Beatrice's speech is factually correct. It is true that many terrible actions have been committed under the auspices of the Catholic Church. It is also true that individual leaders within the Catholic Church can and should have done more in light of these sins. But I disagree that we can move from these facts to the conclusion that the Catholic Church can never pay for its sins. My speech will be divided into two parts. First, that the grave sins of certain high-profile leaders and parishes should not tarnish the entire church. And second, that the Catholic Church has shown clear improvements in terms of accountability and reform. And to conclude that the Catholic Church can never pay for its sins is to ignore this positive trend. So let's start with the first part. The premise of my speech also happens, quite interestingly, to be a definitional challenge. The Catholic Church does not just consist of its fallen religious leaders. It comprises all 45,000 deacons, 450,000 priests, and 1.3 billion baptized Catholics around the world. Equating the Catholic Church with the Vatican leadership is a mistake similar to equating the United Kingdom with Westminster. After all, what is an institution without its people? But at this point, I haven't proven anything yet. I just want to set the frame for what I'm going to discuss. Because if you accept this broad definition of the Catholic Church, the next question to ask is, what sins has the Catholic Church committed? And here it's important to separate the actions of individual church leaders from the moral character of the Catholic Church. Proposition might argue, predictably, that the sins of individual figures reflect a systems-level flaw. After all, in the 2004 Church Commission report, it revealed that over 4,000 US Roman Catholic priests, as we mentioned, faced sexual abuse allegations in the last 50 years. But I think we can identify two sins for the institution rather than the individual. The first is the sin of negligence, the failure of the church leadership to discharge its duty of care. And second, the sin of covering up crimes committed by its members. I put to you that these sins do not meet the threshold of grave sins that B insinuates meets the unforgivable line. My view is that the individual perpetrators of these crimes, people like Cardinal Bernard Law and Cardinal George Pell, may never be able to pay for their sins. But at the same time, the Catholic Church can pay for its sins. The reason being, the sins committed by the individual perpetrators of these crimes are substantively different from the sins that have been committed by the Catholic Church. On one hand, the individual church leaders are guilty of consciously inflicting harm on innocent children. But on the other hand, the Catholic Church is guilty of creating an environment in which this harm could occur due to negligence in the cover-up of these actions. So my first preliminary conclusion is that these two types of guilt are not morally equivalent. It is perhaps easier for the Catholic Church as an organization to pay for its sins as opposed to individual church leaders. Next part of my speech. How then should the Catholic Church pay for its sins? I think there are two ways in which a sin can be repaid. First, it's reparation, making sure that your victims are given adequate care and support. Marcel, the second speaker on opposition bench, will discuss the reparative efforts of the Catholic Church and why that's important. The second way a sin can be repaid is prevention, making sure that potential future victims are well protected so they don't have to suffer abuse. The rest of my speech will discuss the preventative efforts of the Catholic Church and why I believe the Church will continue to build on present-day gains. There are three reasons why I'm optimistic about the Catholic Church's efforts at reform. Reason one, because the Catholic Church's leadership recognizes that it needs to restore faith among lay people and non-believers by becoming more transparent. Given the context of declining church attendances and a souring of public perception towards the church, we have observed very significant steps towards progress. A few years ago, the Vatican started publishing data about the hundreds of abuse cases that were handled by its disciplinary body. In 2015, Pope Francis called for a Vatican that operates with quote-unquote absolute transparency, gathering over 165 cardinals for high-level meetings to overhaul the dysfunctional bureaucracy of the Roman Curia. The key argument here is that in the aftermath of damaging sexual abuse scandals, the church leadership has demonstrated both a willingness and a capacity for transparency that appears set to continue. And in fact, Bee hints at that herself, where she says that you go onto a Wikipedia page and you can look at the fact that these abuses have happened. This contributes to the structural environment under which the Catholic Church is more compelled to remain transparent in the long run. The second reason why I think there is a positive trend is because under Pope Francis, the Church's leadership has become more willing to accept blame for their mistakes and to hold fellow cardinals and bishops accountable. This is primarily due to both the controversies as well as the Pope's reformist instincts. For example, it's true that many of the Pope's attempts at deeper reforms might have been frustrated, but at the same time, errant church leaders are being held more accountable than ever before. For example, in response to the Chilean abuse crisis, Pope Francis admitted that he was wrong to side with local bishops against survivors. He accused the Chilean bishops of abuse, cover-ups, and destroying evidence. It is worth noting that in the aftermath of those comments, every single Chilean bishop presented their resignation letter to the Pope after the Vatican launched this investigation. I put to you that this trend of accountability isn't just due to the leadership of Pope Francis. I argue that even the conservative, anti-reformist elements of the Catholic Church recognize that in the age of social media and greater public scrutiny, the Church can no longer shroud its actions in secrecy. It creates structural incentives to be more accountable and to demonstrate to the public that the Church is taking decisive action. The third reason I want to bring to you is that there has been an important shift in the Catholic Church's teachings, a movement towards the gospel of mercy and compassion. And as being mentioned in the words of Pope Francis, if a person is gay and seeks out the Lord and is willing, who am I to judge that person? Also in the words of the Pope, we have to work harder to develop a profound theology of women within the Church. Now, I know proposition might argue that this is just rhetoric, but I disagree. The way sermons are framed have a huge effect on how lay Catholics view themselves, the way they interact with secular politics and what they teach their children. I think this movement away from punitive messaging towards a narrative of compassion is as important as initiatives regarding accountability and transparency. I think no one in this chamber tonight denies that there have been some terrible scandals associated with the Catholic Church, and by no means in my speech am I downplaying the severity of these cases of abuse. But I would, however, urge the members of this House to consider three things. First, that it would be a mistake to conflate the sinful elements of the Catholic Church's leadership with the Church as a whole. Second, that the sins of the Catholic Church not one and the same as the sins of its errant leaders. And third, that the Church has and will continue to reform for the better. I am incredibly proud to oppose.